Hi, my name is Alexis Buettgen, and I'm here to present my doctoral research on workplace accommodations in the Ontario nonprofit sector. My presentation stems from a concern about the impacts of the use of medical documentation in workplace accommodations as an exclusive practice that disrupts positive social relations and presents distrust and places the medical model at the center of this process. This presentation is part of a larger qualitative study I did a couple of years ago to explore strategies to create inclusive workplaces within the Ontario nonprofit sector. I was interested in this sector of the labour market because it's relatively absent in research on disability and employment in Canada. Just a quick overview of my methodology. I conducted an institutional analysis drawing from institutional ethnography. I looked at 3 nonprofit service providing organizations in Southern Ontario that had a documented history or had received awards for conducting inclusive workplace practices. I talked with senior leaders, frontline employees with disabilities from each of these organizations and conducted a textual analysis. What I found was that the workplace accommodation process was really central to employees' experiences of inclusivity or exclusion in the workplace. So I want to show you the differences in the 3 processes that I found. At organization A, that was the first organization, this was a relatively small consumer-driven disabled people's organization promoting and supporting people with disabilities primarily. This was a relatively informal accommodation process whereby the employee made an accommodation request to their direct manager and then waited for a response while the manager checked in with the executive director. They made a decision about the suitability of the request and then chatted with the employee and their manager to discuss and complete an accommodation agreement utilizing the human resource policy. At organization B, another small consumer-driven organization serving people with disabilities, was a similar process in that the employee makes an accommodation request to their supervisor, human resource manager, or executive director. They then draft an accommodation plan and check that over with the employee to complete an accommodation request using an accommodation plan template and their accommodation policy. Organization C was notably different. This was a relatively large organization of more than 500 employees. It was not consumer driven. It served both people with and without disabilities. This process was much more complicated in that the employee makes an accommodation request to their supervisor, human resources, or union representative. They then consult with an external disability management consultant who makes a request of the employee to gather medical documentation from their doctor on their functional abilities and disabilities in order to assess that against the job demands of the position that the employee is in. They then draft up an accommodation plan template exclusive of the employee, and then host a formal meeting with the employee, disability management consultant, human resources, union representative, and the employee's supervisor to complete an accommodation plan. What I found in looking at these 3 processes was that each organization drew from the same governing text of the Ontario Human Rights Code. However, the readings of the features of the code was noticeably different. Organization C centered on medical documentation as the primary basis for the organization to plan and implement accommodations. This meant that the organization relied on the documentation as representing the actualities of what the organization knew about the needs of individual employees. In this way, when an employee entered the accommodation process at the organization, they became an abstraction through the work of those who reconstructed the employee's life as a case history or set of functional limitations and effectively detached the employee from the experience of their disability, their history, their perspectives, capacities, interests, concerns, and potentialities. On the other hand, representatives from organization A and B spoke about how they avoided the use of medical documentation in that process and instead focused on how they structured the workplace to include diverse workers. They acknowledged that they could utilize medical documentation in the accommodation process in accordance with the code, but decided not to take this up in practice because they wanted to recognize employees' subjective bodily experiences and take the word of the employee as evidence for their need for accommodation and then demonstrate trust. So in conclusion, These findings highlighted that the complexity of the accommodation process increases when trying to fit individuals' limitations into organizational processes, as opposed to changing the workplace to better suit the diversity of workers. I found some differences between the experiential way of knowing disability from the subjective lived experiences of employees with disabilities versus the ideological way of knowing disability and accommodation when you look to external experts or medical documentation in this process. I also found that employees at organization A and B expressed much higher satisfaction in the accommodation process when they were able to build trust and have positive social relations with their senior leaders. So overall, I argue that there's a need to transform the workplace rather than the individual to try to get them to fit into environments that were not designed for them. And that this transformation should begin from individuals' subjective everyday experiences at work, whereby work is understood to account for all the things that people do that require some sort of effort to maintain employment. I also found that the nonprofit sector is indeed a potential site for inclusive employment when considering the nature of positive social relations. So there's a lot more to learn about some of the work that I've done here. I want to thank you for listening and watching to this video. For more information about the study, you can read my dissertation online. You can watch or listen to a previous webinar about the research, or you can contact me via email, and I would be happy to talk further. Thank you.